Welcome to the inaugural podcast of the Pennsylvania Political Digest. Join us as we take a stroll through the annals of Pennsylvania political corruption. A disgraced attorney general whose twin sister also worked there, who went down for lying to the court. Two former House speakers shared the same prison cell for a time. Not one, not two, but three Republican sisters taken down, two of whom were elected officials, and one was their campaign manager. An entire Philadelphia court system eliminated due to fraud and corruption. A powerful Philadelphia state senator with a vacuum fixation, yes, a vacuum fixation, funded by OPM, other people's money, not his. Congressmen taking bribes from fake Arab sheiks. A GOP attorney general went down by what he did in his previous job, who still managed to finish second in the 1994 Republican primary for governor. Multiple state treasurers were indicted, and one who very tragically and publicly killed himself during a press conference live on TV. Even the Capitol building itself was christened with corruption during a scandal when it was built in the early 1900s that in today's dollars would equal nearly $500 million. So as you can see, we have lots to talk about on the Pennsylvania Political Digest podcast, a stroll through the annals of Pennsylvania political corruption. I'm your host, Republican political consultant Christopher Nicholas. I'm joined by two veteran reporters who've covered Pennsylvania politics for decades. Brad Bumsted recently retired after a long career as a Capitol and political reporter for the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review and the Lancaster Newspaper Group, among others. And he's written not one but two books on political corruption in the state. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you, Chris. I look forward to this discussion.
And we are also joined by the semi-retired John Baer, the longtime political columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News, who now writes a weekly column for the Penn Live Harrisburg Patriot News outlet. John's written one book about Pennsylvania politics. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Chris. I thought you were going to say semi-literate.
Well, that may prove to be true as well, John. So as an FYI, I've yet written no books. In each of our 5 episodes in this podcast, we will review the quirks and the nooks and crannies of some of the most absorbing political corruption cases, primarily from the modern era here in Pennsylvania. We will feature in each episode a main story and a secondary story. Today's main focus is the meteoric rise and subsequent fall of Pennsylvania's first Democratic Attorney General, Kathleen Kane, who styled herself as a quote-unquote prosecutor, not a politician. But first, we're going to take a quick look at our secondary story today, which may explain, perhaps, our culture of political corruption. Our actual Capitol building itself started off in a typical Pennsylvania fashion. John?
Well, that's very true, Chris. You got to go back 120 years if you're talking about corruption in Pennsylvania, because basically that's where it began, with the planning and construction of the magnificent Capitol building. It's a national treasure, and when President Theodore Roosevelt was there to dedicate it, he said he had never seen a grander building in his life. But as it turned out, his superlatives may have been overstated because you could say that that building was the root of all evil when it came to Pennsylvania politics. And why? Well, the state legislature at the time appropriated $4 million to build the thing. Its actual cost was more than 3 times that, $13 million by the time they got done, which in today's dollar adds up to just about $500 million, $500 million. So it's a pretty nice place. Why did the cost triple? Well, corruption, fraud, graft, charging for services and goods that never were delivered, overcharging for others. 2 quick examples. The flagpole on the roof, starting right at the top, was charged $850. This is in 1905. Its actual worth at that time was $150, so, 8 times the cost. There was a mahogany case built for the Senate barber shop, $3,257. Its actual worth, $300.
Now our major focus today, the brief and contentious reign of Kathleen Kane, the first Democrat and elected woman attorney general. Since it became an elected office in 1980, The office had been held by Republicans. In 2012, Kane changed all that. Brad, very briefly, what would be your, again, brief description of her time as Attorney General?
A great first year, predictions that she would go on to, serve in the U.S. Senate, some support for doing that, possibly even higher federal office someday. She had it all, looks, fresh face, money, smarts, and a lot of good political skills. At first, it looked like nothing could stop her. But by her second year, there was a case that it was a bombshell story in the Philadelphia Inquirer that wound up being her undoing, and that we can go into. But it was something that said a lot about her personality and her desire to succeed at all costs.
John, why don't you give us an overview of some of her issues at the beginning of her reign?
Well, I mean, her issues, we can talk about. What we need to set is sort of the playing field here. I mean, this is a story that should be a Netflix drama series or, some high school Shakespearean tragedy play by the time we get all done with it. I mean, it starts in the state's sixth largest city, but the place that's the most politically disproportionate place in Pennsylvania, when you think about it. I mean, Scranton, PA, was the home of two governors, two attorneys general, a United States senator, and, of course, the president of the United States. I mean, there's something in the atmosphere up there, and I think it's oxygen, coal dust, and politics. I mean, the place is it thrives with politics. So here comes Kathleen Granahan, who grew up in West Scranton in a rented half-double, one of four kids. Dad was a janitor, worked at a convenience store manager. Mom was a secretary at a car dealership. Kathleen goes to West Scranton High School, where she's a cheerleader and a member of the National Honor Society. She goes to the University of Scranton, a fine Jesuit institution, Temple Law, goes to a Philly law firm after that, becomes an assistant DA in Lackawanna County and prosecutes, ironically, tons of sex abuse cases, marries well, Chris Kane, who owns a family trucking company and is very wealthy. So she's educated, accomplished, attractive, has the perfect storyline for politics. And then with her husband's money and Bill Clinton's endorsement, she runs as a Democrat for Attorney General in 2012, Barack Obama's election year, a good year for Democrats. And this is in an atmosphere, Chris, with many Pennsylvanians questioning then-Governor Tom Corbett's handling of the very public Jerry Sandusky Penn State sex scandal when Republican Corbett was the Attorney General himself. And it no doubt helped that, Kane and others were questioning whether or not he dragged out the grand jury process, dragged out the investigation to get some political gain for his own futures. And that was no doubt helped by a Franklin and Marshall poll in September of 2012, just before the election, that showed only 17% of state voters thought Corbett did a good or excellent job with the Sandusky investigation. So Kane wins election by 15 points, more votes than anyone on the ballot, including President Obama. And she all of a sudden is a national story, first woman, first Democrat to win that office, in a state, by the way, that has never elected a woman female governor or female U.S. senator, and that had a historically dismal percentage of women in the legislature. In fact, that year in 2012, Pennsylvania ranked 42nd in the percentage of women in the state legislature. She is immediately talked about as maybe even opposing Corbett for his reelection in 2014 or running for a U.S. Senate seat. When she was on MSNBC with Chris Matthews, he made some reference to her one day being a presidential candidate. She was at the top of the political mountain. And a column I wrote right before she took office, early 2013, the first sentence was, Kathleen Kane is an invader, because that was the nickname of the West Scranton High School team for which she was a cheerleader. But she really did invade Pennsylvania politics. She changed the landscape with one election and was expected to do great things. Those expectations never really played out.
Kane's downfall and resignation after losing her law license and being convicted of perjury laid the groundwork for the rise of our new governor, Josh Shapiro. Because if Kane had had a successful first term, she would have won, re-election in 2016. Instead, she had resigned, and then that allowed Josh Shapiro to run for his first term as Attorney General then, which led to his, what I think has been a very quick rise as well. And Brad, before you get into the details of the trial, I just want to explain to people another only in Pennsylvania story. She has an identical twin sister who also worked in the Attorney General's office.
Indeed, she did have a twin sister. And at one of the opening days of the trial, Kane and her entourage were headed to the courtroom, and it appeared that she was at the very front of this line of people who walked in. It turns out it was her twin sister, Ellen, and they did this on purpose to stick it to the media because photographers went crazy when this happened, and only later did they discover that it was Kane was further back in line. This was not her at all.
Brad, let me just add on that point, which is a great one. At the time, the New York Post had one of the New York Post-type headlines on that very story, and the headline was, "Foxy Attorney General tricks media with twin sister."
That's true. Although in the end, it made no difference whatsoever because by the time they got to the courtroom, Kane took her seat as the defendant. And it's not like her sister was trying to pose as the defendant and take a fall for her, which maybe she would have done. I don't know. But where this case originates from is an investigation by former Republican Attorney Generals Tom Corbett and his successor, Linda Kelly. They had launched an investigation, what they believed were some corrupt legislators from Philadelphia, imagine that, who were, they believed, willing to take some bribes in return for supporting legislation. So they send in an undercover agent who had a long sordid history and had been a lobbyist, and he goes in and starts offering cash to these legislatures, and it's videotaped because he's wearing a camera in his glasses. So he can, it's all recorded, and he's going and handing out cash. It's crazy.
Didn't he also hand out like a bracelet or something like that?
That's not to the legislators. That was to a judge.
Sorry, I get them all mixed up.
A traffic court judge. They had a traffic court in Philadelphia at the time, basically to fix tickets for politicians and other folks. I mean, they did some legitimate work, I'm sure. But in any case, this was an ugly, ugly case. These people were on tape. One of them, former Representative Juan Waters, got a couple $1,000. He's, "Happy birthday, Ron Waters," and it's the kind of thing that just really made you wonder. But the day shortly after she took office, former prosecutors of Corbett and Kelly who were leaving briefed Kane on cases that were pending. And one of them they briefed her on was this undercover investigation, which had never been brought to fruition. There had never been indictments. So they advised her of it. She didn't do anything with it. On March the 16th, the day before St. Patty's Day in 2014, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran this blockbuster story how Kane had decided not to prosecute these legislators who were videotaped taking cash. And when we later saw the videotapes, it was clear as a bell.
Did she say why she didn't want to prosecute them, Brad?
There were a number of reasons, but she claimed there was no legal predicate of a crime that had occurred. That's why, that you can't just offer somebody cash if you don't believe they did something wrong. Of course, we know from a very famous case of legislators taking cash in Congress, abscam, they didn't have any predicate, really. They offered cash, they took it. So if somebody offers you cash in return for something, it can be a crime.
I also remember that there was some concern from her part that she didn't want to prosecute those legislators because they were all African American.
That's correct. That was another part of it. She thought it was racial in terms of, tagging these particular people, that they hadn't targeted any white people. That wasn't true because I did see a list then of everybody this lobbyist had approached, this record, and it did show that there were a number of different white legislators from the area who were approached. Most just didn't take. One guy did take some sports tickets and other things, but not cash.
This Pennsylvania Political Digest podcast is supported by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association, where business in Pennsylvania is our business and has been since our founding in 1909. For more information, please visit pamanufacturers.org.
So anyway, it was this case proceeds, and Kane, we learned later, was absolutely livid about this. She could not believe that Frank Fina, in particular, who was one of the top prosecutors under Corbett, she believed that he had leaked this information to the Inquirer. So she was bound and determined to get back at him.
Do you think he did leak it, you guys? What do you think? You're reporters.
Well, obviously somebody leaked it. I mean, the Inquirer didn't take a guess at that.
No.
I mean, that's how news happens, particularly when it comes to corruption cases. So maybe Frank Fina didn't do that directly. Maybe somebody under his authority did. Maybe somebody without his authority did. But in those kinds of cases, there are a lot of people are involved, from technicians who set up all the equipment to others, and it's who knows who leaked it. The important thing is it became public, as it should have.
Well, exactly right. And so whether he leaked it or knew of it, we don't really know. But he denied it. He said he didn't do it, as did a deputy of his.
And then he went to work for the Philadelphia district attorney.
He did, and that launches a whole other avenue. But it's basically to try to bring this around. Kathleen Kane decided to get back at Fina, so she leaked some information about an investigation that Fina had done, where he did not prosecute a black leader in Philadelphia for, a couple things, but it wasn't taking cash. And it turns out there was no crime there, but he just did not, bring this case to fruition.
So again, I don't want to skip over this. This is the state's top prosecutor saying she's going to get back at somebody who used to work for one of her predecessors for what she believed was leaking that big story about her not prosecuting those black legislators from Philadelphia, leaking it to the Philadelphia Inquirer. So this is what she decided to do with all the power you have as Attorney General.
By all the evidence, all the people we talked to in her office, and people were really talking towards the end. I mean, I had prosecutors calling me up as it proceeded towards trial, just saying, this is the puzzle palace over here. You wouldn't believe what's going on. And it's as people were resigning, in droves to get away from Kane. But it's interesting, I think, that the hit that she took from the Inquirer, and it was a big one, I believe that she had enough popularity and was well-liked enough that she might have been able to take that hit and move on.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, the problem was this was early in her administration. She could have waited. Revenge may be sweet, but sometimes it's slow. I mean, there could have been many opportunities down the road to, in some way, if she had it in her heart to get back at Fina or whoever she thought was the villain here, that might have presented itself. But her reaction, nearly immediate and visceral, is what led to her eventual downfall. Because once you start to roll down that hill, it's pretty hard to stop the momentum.
And in terms of a slide that appeared on a big screen at her trial, a quote from her was, "Revenge is best served cold." And that was a comment she made in a text message to a political consultant, Josh Morrow. And, it was a devastating point there. I mean, if you didn't believe that she was trying to get back at Fina to that point, you certainly did after that.
So basically, she lied to the court about going after Fina, right? And she was convicted of lying about it, which, when you do
and covering it up,
is called perjury.
Yes.
She lost her law license. The state Senate put together a special committee to review whether she could still keep the job as Attorney General, and everybody who testified basically said no.
Right. Without a law license, how can you be an attorney?
How can you run an office of attorneys if you yourself are not a licensed attorney? So only in Pennsylvania can you have an Attorney General who's not a licensed lawyer, but her twin sister in the same office is. And
it was brought to trial in the Senate. There was a vote on it in the Senate and came really close, but there weren't enough votes to throw her out.
And then this case against her was being prosecuted in Montgomery County Court.
Right.
Correct?
Right. And one of her themes that she developed by then was she was the victim of an old boys network. That it was the old boys out to get her. And there are a number of women I've talked to who believe, well, yeah, that was probably the case. And this, of course, then delves into the porn that was swirling around her office. And she tied Fina directly into some of this so-called porn, I should say, because, some of it was, well, generally might be called pornographic. A lot of it was just inappropriate jokes and comments and things like that. But in any case, there really was no way for her to get past this without, some defense. And she went hard with the old boys network. She even had Lanny Davis come in, former Clinton advisor, who was pushing that.
Let me just mention that the old boys thing, you have to remember the context of the time. As we talked about earlier, she was the first woman to win that statewide office in a state that was not particularly interested in electing women to statewide offices, particularly high ones. So that sell, I mean, that carried some weight for a while. That she would argue that these guys are so outraged that that a woman has come among their midst, particularly prosecutors. Prosecutors are tough people and overwhelmingly male, at least in 2012, 2013. And so she had some traction with that argument.
It was a valid political argument.
Yeah, it was
not a great legal argument.
And when you were talking about the porn, Brad, just to be clear, we're talking about this was like it shared inner office porn and shared outer office porn.
Yeah, and it came from Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, right. Right.
This was supposed pornography shared via email back in the day when people still used email a lot. They would kind of forward bad jokes, inappropriate jokes, and it snared a lot of people. I like to use that word with politics, and snared.
Well, 2 Supreme Court justices had to leave the court because of it.
Well, we're going to get that in the future episode, Brad. So let's not spoil that. As we wrap up here on this first part about Kathleen Kane, Brad, you told us a story when we were planning this, what I think is a poignant story about the only rebuttal witness that Kathleen Kane called in her trial and what happened after that.
Yeah, she called her son to the trial, and he was 12 or 13 years old at the time. And he took the stand basically just to talk about how they could not do without mom. They needed mom to be home. And it was, really hard to hear him say all that stuff. And I'm sure it was devastating for him to have to do that. However, it raises the question of whether you would put your son or daughter on the stand in something like that. And that same day, not long after that, she was convicted and let off in cuffs. And that night, actually.
So her 12-year-old son had to witness that.
Didn't have to, but he did.
He did. John, final thoughts on Kathleen Kane's contentious tenure as Attorney General?
Well, like I said, it ought to be a movie or a Netflix series. I mean,
well, this could be the start of it.
I want royalties, and so does Brad. It's just one of those very rare stories that happens so quickly. I mean, most political careers take a long time to evaporate or incinerate. This one went up in record time. The rise was just as fast as the fall. Not a lot of stories in Pennsylvania with this kind of a broad impact and lasting memory.
Yeah, and it was bizarre at times toward the end in terms of her actions and things that were going on in the office. It's a wonder how they even ran an office to prosecute people, because everyone, not everyone, but most of the attorneys I talked to, the prosecutors, were really upset by all of this. They were upset by how it hurt the image of the office, which it did, and they felt like it hurt their careers just having worked there, which probably in some cases it did, but not.
Yeah, most prosecutors don't want to be involved in being prosecuted themselves. They don't want to be the story. They want to be, have the defendants be the story. So as we wrap up on Kane, I'm going to just give a little political context. Literally every office above Attorney General, Democrats were saying, well, Kathleen Kane could run for that. And I think knowing Northeast Pennsylvania politics as I do, which we call NEPA, N-E-P-A, Northeast PA, NEPA, her response to FINA in her mind, betraying her was to me a typical Scranton response. You come after me, I'm going to come after you, with no regard to what her office, her high office, meant she really had to do serving the citizens of Pennsylvania rather than herself. So that, to me, is the final political part of Kathleen Kane, who could have been pretty much anything she wanted to afterwards. But sometimes, the pressure of a higher office gets to people.
I think that's a great point about the NEPA background, because that is what I hear and what I've seen from people up in that area. Is if you're attacked, you go after somebody. You don't worry about the consequences. You hit back, smack them, and let the chips fall where they may. And it does seem like she did that.
Thanks for listening to the inaugural episode of the podcast. If you'd like to send feedback or make a contribution, head over to papoliticaldigest.com. That's papoliticaldigest.com. Thank you.
So now that we've discussed the case of the downfall of the first Democratic Attorney General, I wanted to make people know that here in Pennsylvania, we are equal opportunity purveyors of political corruption. And in a later show, we were talking about another Attorney General from Scranton who went down in flames, Ernie Priate, who was and still is a Republican. But now, as we wrap up this initial episode, we're going to go back and talk a little bit more about our secondary story, the birth of our corrupt Capitol building itself in Harrisburg, which, as John said, is one of the most beautiful capitals in the country. I would say it even rivals our U.S. Capitol. John?
Overtly ornate throughout, built without regard to expense, the Carrara marble, statues, stained glass windows, intricate mosaic flooring, gold leaf everywhere. Within a year after the dedication, 13 people were charged with crimes related to its construction and planning, including the principal architect, Joseph Huston, the principal contractor, a state auditor general who didn't audit anything, a state treasurer who paid for everything, sometimes without bills, and a congressman who was an officer in a construction company. Many of them went to prison, and many remain forever honored. You know, there are 2 1-ton each bronze doors at the main entrance, and anyone going in can look, and the heads of these principal pals and contractors and architects are sculpted on the doors. One is over the keyhole. So they remain there as permanent honorees, I guess, to the state's just beginning legacy of corruption, the same way that portraits of our former House speakers, 2 of them, and a former Senate President pro tem, who were indicted and imprisoned for corruption in the more current years, they still hang in the Capitol's main first-floor hallways. It's like we're proud of it.
So we're kind of, it's not unexpected how we are today, given that, as you said, the root of all evil started with the Capitol. And Brad, you wrote about this in one of your books, that really the whole birth of modern Pennsylvania politics was born out of a basic construction corruption case.
Yeah. One thing about that is that at that time, there was no CNN, there was no podcast, there was no, you didn't have instant communication across the state, just, newspapers that went out pretty slowly. And this became a huge issue despite the lack of statewide media, being like it is today. It was a very big issue. People were very angry about it. And John mentioned that some of these people were convicted and went to prison. There were also, according to Paul Beers' book, he was a historian who wrote about the Capitol, several committed suicide. I haven't verified that, but he had that in his book. Second thing is that charges were filed and people served about 6 months in jail for this. Houston served 6 months. But it really, didn't fit the crime. I mean, you can imagine maybe they might have been sentenced to years in prison, and they didn't. And here's what I found out in my research about this. If you look at all the facts, this is just a theory, but it's based on a sound one. No political bosses were convicted in this. There is no way that you could have a $14 million, theft or thereabouts without Boise Penrose and some of the other big political figures from the time getting a cut of it or directing it or, somehow at least getting a piece for their people. And that didn't happen. No one was even touched in that. And, it's my belief that, these people were fall guys, if you will, including the architect, and that the prosecutors at the time just would not go after. I mean, we got to remember, this was the boss era. This was a time where a couple people two people might control the whole state. This time it was one, Boise Penrose. They even have a statue of him, by the way, not far from the Capitol. School kids go and look at Boise Penrose there. That was a time, too. He was a U.S. senator because at that time the legislature elected members of the Senate. Can you imagine that happening today?
Yeah, that'd be great. Brad, you're absolutely right. The thing that struck me about that when in trying to do a little bit of research in this, I found a front page New York Times story.
Yes.
in 1907 that listed the 13 people that were indicted in this. And it is interesting. I mean, I think only 6 eventually went to prison. And as
about 13.
Of 13. And as you say, for not a long time. There had to have been a fix in here somewhere. Or else defense lawyers were a lot better in those days. I don't know, one or the other. But you're right. It was that era. It was the boss era. And in many, many ways, it hung around in Pennsylvania probably longer than in other states.
Yeah.
So did all that terribleness, guys, you think, kind of like seep into the marble and then kind of still kind of gets excreted every so often? So,
right,
the people, the people that work there kind of getting affected?
Well, it is Carrara marble, and especially those statues of the naked people right outside the front door, which, incidentally, they were naked initially. I mean, the social class of the time said, no, we can't have that, so they had to replaster over certain private parts. But Carrara marble is susceptible to seepage, and maybe that's what happened throughout the building. Yeah.
I think that what is really important about that is not, whether it set the stage for or, somehow was transferred to others, but it's this cover-up that occurred. And, there had to be a huge cover-up, and that's not just based on theory, but on fact at the time. And if that's the case, that's perfect for paving the way for the rest of.
What's that old saying? The more things change,
right,
the more they stay the same. So corruption, cover-up, overbillings, people getting off scot-free, and not only that, having statues made of them. And on that fine note, we're going to wrap up this initial episode of the Pennsylvania Political Digest, stroll through the annals of Pennsylvania political corruption. In our next episode, our major focus will be on Bonusgate and the fact that not one but 2 House speakers were in jail at the same time and for a brief moment shared the same cell, again from the We Can't Make This Up file of Pennsylvania political corruption. And our secondary focus will be on some court problems. Not 1, not 2, but 3 Orry sisters who got in trouble with the law. And then we'll talk about a court system in Philadelphia that was entirely shut down and eliminated due to corruption. And on that happy note, we'll say thank you for listening to this initial episode of the Pennsylvania Political Digest, Stroll Through the Annals of Pennsylvania Political Corruption podcast. I want to thank our esteemed journalists, John Baer and Brad Bumsted. I want to thank our sound engineer, Tucker Nicholas. Thank you. The bumper music you've heard is courtesy of Interstate 81. I'm your host, Republican political consultant Christopher Nicholas. If you have any comments about our podcast, any tips, any replies, please send your emails to papoliticaldigest@gmail.com. That's papoliticaldigest@gmail.com. If they're interesting, we might read them on the air. Copyright 2023 Eagle Consulting Group, Inc.,